Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's really nice to see you joining this workshop. So today we will discuss how to write and submit a research manuscript, publish or perish, a very dreadful title. And I will have a pleasure to facilitate this workshop with Dr. Anna Grimsrud. Anna, do you want to say a few words before we start?
Sure, just to say welcome to everyone and thanks for introducing yourself in the chat. And I just want to let you know a recording and the slides will be available later. So we'll see you soon. Go for it, Marlène.
Thanks. So let's start. So today we are all here to know how to write a manuscript and how to publish a manuscript more than just writing it. So the objectives of the workshop today are twofold. By the end of the workshop, we would like you to know more about how to write a research manuscript that will be representative of your research. And we would also you to know a bit more about the editorial process of an article publication. So we will give you tips on how to make your reviewers and your editors happy. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please type any question you have in the Q&A section of the webinar through the session, and we will answer to questions at the very end of the meeting. We will have time. The recording will be made available after the webinar, and you can email us at workshops@iassociety.org if you have any question about the webinar. Before we start, I'd like to thank our donor, VIF Healthcare, that make this important workshop possible. So a few words about the Journal of the International AIDS Society. For those of you who do not know us, JIAS is a multidisciplinary journal, a platform for the dissemination of essential HIV research. And we publish a lot of various disciplines, from basic science to clinical science, epi, policy, health economics, and implementation science as well. The journal is published online. It's peer-reviewed, open access, and with a very fresh new impact factor of 6.7. And we do also organize some capacity building opportunities, workshops, as we are doing today. So if you are joining AIDS 2022 in July in Montreal, please join us, as we will have another live session of this workshop. So let's get started. Why is it so important to publish? Well, from a scientific point of view, results that are not published mean the research did not take place. So it means that you can have the most amazing results if you do not communicate about those, if you do not share your lesson learned with the rest of the world, well, no one will know. So it's important because publishing will advance both scientists and science. So to get you warm up a little bit, we are going to start with a little poll question. So I'm going to ask you to vote. And please ask yourself, what makes a good manuscript? So to your opinion, is it A, an interesting topic, B, a large sample size, C, a good scientific question, D, a setting of interest, or E, all of the above? So you will see a poll question just appearing on your screens just right now, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to vote. We have a great audience today. We have already a bit over 500 people in the room with us, so that's very exciting, and we're really happy to see all of you here with us. So I'm giving you maybe 5 more seconds, and then we will go into the results. So very clearly, you mentioned that, so 6% of you said an interesting topic, 28% a good scientific question, 1% setting of interest, and 64% all of the above. Let's look at the results together. It is all of the above. It will really depend on your research, but obviously if your topic is not, interesting topic is very subjective, right? What you find interesting, your neighbor might not find interesting. But what we know is that you need to have a good scientific question. You need to have a large sample size, or large enough to be able to draw a conclusion on. You need to have a very clearly defined topic and an interesting setting as well. Before writing a manuscript, you need to pause and ask yourself, why you want to publish your work and whether it is publishable, meaning do you have enough results or do you still need to have a little bit more work before it is publishable? You need to decide what type of manuscript to write, because there are many different kinds of manuscript, from research manuscript to commentaries, reviews. You need to choose the target journal, pay attention to journal requirements in the guidelines for authors, pay attention to the structure of the offer of the paper, and understand publication ethics to avoid violation. Now, when you have that in mind quite clearly, it's time to start. And before starting, we will never say that enough, order your thoughts. So write down an overview of your manuscript, and you can do that by answering these questions in short sentences. If you cannot clearly convey key messages here, you risk not being clear in your manuscript either. So ask yourself, have I done something new and interesting? What problems did my study address? How did my study address these? What are my key findings? How can I make my work replicable? How confident am I in my work? Are my conclusions justified and not overstated? And what are the possible implications for research, for policy, for practice? As I mentioned, there are very different kinds of manuscripts. So the structure will very much depend on the type of manuscript you are decided to write. It can be different if it's a debate, a review, or research article, for example. Today, we will really focus only on research manuscripts. And each journal will have its own instruction on how to structure your manuscript. So that's worth deciding before you start writing. But in general, so the headings might be a bit different, but the structure is usually as follows. You have an abstract, you have an introduction, a methods and materials section, the results, table and figures, the discussion, and the references. The order to write a manuscript depends very much on your preferences, but in general, people do start with the figures and the table. You decide what you want to put in your article to answer to your research questions. So you start by drawing or putting your figures and your tables together. You write the legends. Then you start writing the methods, because you know how you did your research. And when you've done that, usually you put together that into the results section, meaning that you have your figures and you have a narrative around the results that you're presenting. Then usually scientists then work on the introduction, setting up the scene, then the discussion, which might be a bit more challenging because there are less guidelines to help you do your discussion. But today we will give you some tips on how to do that in the easiest way. Then usually comes the abstract and then the other part of a manuscript, which are the acknowledgement section, the references, the disclaimers, and so on. Obviously, through this process, it is really important that you discuss your paper with your colleagues, show them initial drafts, get feedback, as much feedback as possible. And if you have the opportunity to present your results, to tell your story in meetings or conferences, please do. That's really important, and that will help you write your paper. So the second poll today is asking you, why is the title of a paper so important? Is it A, because it's the part most often read, B, it's often the only part read, C, it discloses basic information and helps readers decide if they want to read more, D, it's a mini advertisement of your paper, or E, all of the above? Again, we're going to give you a few seconds to vote and we will see the results all together. I see that there's a consensus coming up. So 5 more seconds. So I'm sharing the results. 63% of you guys say that it was all of the above. And it is actually very true. The title is the part most often read and often the only part read. It has to be short, it has to be specific. representative and informative. So it's sort of a mini advertisement of your work, and it will discloses all the basic information and help your readers decide if they want to read more. So you need to make sure that your title will contain the keywords for search engines, so the readers can find your article in various databases. So ask yourself, how would you search for this piece of information in PubMed or Google Scholar, for example? So when you design your title, ask yourself this question. Now, we have an example of a title, and this example is Predictors and Consequences of HIV Status Disclosure in Eastern Cape, South Africa, a prospective cohort study. So this is a title from an article published in the Journal of International AIDS Society. So I got a blank while it's my journal. It's kind of ironic, but anyway, if you read this title, what kind of information is missing? Do you know what it is about? Do you know where the study took place? Do you know who was the population of interest, the study population? And do you know how they did their research? So again, a little question to keep you warm and engaged, and let us know what you think. So again, the title is Predictors and Consequences of HIV Status Disclosure in Eastern Cape, South Africa, a prospective cohort study. So let's look at the results all together. So 72% of the participants today said that the piece of information that was missing was the study population, the WHO. So let's look at that together. What do we know? We know that they studied the predictors and consequences of HIV status in disclosure. So we know the what. We know that the study took place in Eastern Cape, South Africa. So we know where it took place. So a study setting. And we know that the study design sort of was a prospective cohort study. What we didn't know in the example I showed you was adolescent living with HIV. And we decided for the purpose of this exercise to remove some part of the title. This was part of the original title. So indeed, we had no information about the study population. And why is that important? Well, if you're not working on adolescents, you might not necessarily be interested in reading this article. It might not be useful for your own research. So that's why we are very insisting on telling you guys to put all the very relevant and important information in your title. So what is an abstract? As I was saying, it really should include all important details and data from your research study so it can serve as a standalone summary of your work. So there's a title usually, which is the headline or with the study, headline of a study with the keywords that you can use in various search engines. You have an introduction that will describe the issue, the knowledge gap, and the aim of your particular study. You have a method section with a description of the methodology used or the approach taken. You have a results section, which will summarize the main findings and data from your study and the data that help you answer to your research question. And then the conclusion with the main outcomes, the implications, and the recommendations. Different points that are very important for you to keep in mind. First one is that the headings might change a little bit depending on the journal. So again, look at the journal you want to submit to before you start writing your paper. Sometimes you will have backgrounds, for example, instead of introduction. The other maybe more important part is do not go beyond what is established in your paper. Do not offer non-significant results and do not speculate. It can be very tempting to try to put everything in your abstract. There's usually a word limit in IAS. It is 350 words. It's not a lot, so make sure that every word counts. So the abstract is usually the next section that is most often read and which is mostly freely accessible as well. So remember that not all journals are open access. Some are behind a paywall. So while the full text might be behind the paywall, the abstract, the title of every manuscript will always be freely available. So make sure that your abstract is compelling. Another point to take into consideration is that even if people do have access to the full text, they won't read the whole article unless they have a vested interest in the topic. And many people rely on reading the abstract to decide whether they want to read the entire article. So usually we tend to, or usually sometimes we tend to just like quickly hush the abstract when the main text is being written. Please don't do that and really take the time to write a good abstract. So this is another example. And again, during the entire workshop, we will use an article by Eden and colleagues, which is titled Predictors and Consequences of HIV Status Disclosure to Adolescent Living with HIV in Eastern Cape, South Africa, a prospective core study. And I believe this is a very familiar title for you by now. So the paper has been edited for the purpose of this exercise today. We simplified it, but I invite you to read the full version, which is freely available on the journal's website. So let's read together this abstract example. And the first part, which is the introduction, tells us what we need to know about this paper and the topic. In the first sentence, the authors tell us that WHO recommends full disclosure of HIV positive status to adolescents who acquired HIV perinatally by age 12. So we know that this is the topic of this paper. In the second sentence, they tell us that, however, even among adolescents already engaged in ART, disclosure rates are low. Caregivers often report the child being too young and fear of disclosure worsening adolescents' mental health as reasons for non-disclosure. So this is the issue, the main issue that the authors wants to address. And finally, in the last sentence of the abstract, they tell us about the aim of the study. Here, the aim was to identify the predictors of disclosure and the association of disclosure with adherence, viral suppression, and mental health outcomes. So 3 sentences basically, with 1 sentence dedicated to the topic, the issue, and the aim. In the method section, the authors tell us that the analysis took place from 2014 to 2018, and that the data were collected among a close cohort of adolescents living with HIV in Eastern Cape, South Africa. So we have a study setting here. And in the 2 following sentences, they will tell us about what they studied and how they did it. So basically, they try to identify factors associated with disclosure and assess differences in ART adherence, viral suppression, and mental health symptoms between adolescents by disclosure status. And they also explore differences in the change in mental health symptoms and adherence between study rounds and disclosure groups with logistic regression. Now, if we look at the results, the main finding, I'm not going to read that in details, but what I want you to look at, and you can see with the part which are in red, is that the author here give us, they clearly list basically their main results, and they're very precise with that. They give us like percentages, adjusted odds ratios, and so on. So this is what we expect from an abstract. We need to be able, at a glance, to have the main results, the important results of your study. And then in the conclusion section, the authors will summarize in the first sentence the main outcomes. So they're telling us that awareness of HIV positive status was not associated with higher rates of mental health symptoms or lower rates of viral suppression among adolescents. And they also tell us that disclosure was not associated with worse mental health. And they finally made some recommendations telling us that the findings support the recommendation for timely disclosure to adolescents who were perinatally infected with HIV. But adherence support post-disclosure is important, so some recommendation towards the end. And now that you know everything about how to write a compelling abstract, which is really the short version of the main paper, Anna will guide you through the different section of a research manuscript. Anna, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Marlène. Just before I get started here on the next 20 minutes around how to write a research manuscript, I really want to encourage all of you to ask questions in the Q&A. This will give us some interesting discussion points for the end, and also we'll be able to type some answers as well. And I also just want to say hello from South Africa to those of you on the call. That's where I'm based today. And also hi to Emma in Kenya and Lazarus in Uganda, and to new people joining a JICE workshop for the first time. So again, we're going to focus now on how to write a research manuscript. If you go to the next slide here, you'll see an overview of all of the content that needs to be contained in the introduction of your paper. And this is in a logical format, again, in terms of the order in which you want to write your introduction. You're going to start with the background, and you're going to move on to context, challenge, and the question or aim. And when we say here from general to specific, we mean that you are going to start a bit broad, and you're going to get narrower and more detailed and specific on your topic as you go in the introduction. Now, you might ask how broad you should start. And that really depends on the journal that you're writing to. So for example, if you were submitting HIV research to a global health journal, you might want to speak a little bit more about HIV in the context of global health before you get into the details. By the same measure, if you're going to talk and submit something directly to an HIV journal, you might have something that's much more specific to HIV, and you don't need to talk so broadly about the role of HIV in global health within that introduction section. So by way of example, we'll go forward to the next slide, and you'll see here the introduction or excerpts from the introduction from the paper that Marlène's introduced you to. So if we look at this together, you'll see that they say that in 2020, there were 1.75 million adolescents living with HIV. That's the first paragraph. In the second, they talk about how levels of adherence, retention, and viral suppression are lower among adolescents than younger children and adults. And then in the third paragraph, they talk about how data are limited on the association between the disclosure status and virologic outcomes, and that it's unclear how this impacts on adherence. So we're going to move to my first poll question, and based on that very abbreviated section here, I'm wondering if you guys can all help me by answering what element is missing from the introduction that I just read to you. Is it the background, the context, the challenge, or the aim? And we can go ahead and launch that poll now. And I hope that you will join your 840 other attendees in voting here for what was missing. Just to restate while you're thinking about this, we've obviously edited, as Marlène said, this paper to help us make this example. Okay, so I've got 130 votes so far. Again, what was missing, do you think? The background, the context, the challenge, or the aim or research question? Okay, I'm going to give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to end the poll and share results with all of you. And you'll see that roughly half of you got this right. Marlène, you can move on to the next slide. And that's to say that the question or the aim was missing from this introduction section. And that actually, if we just go ahead on to the next slide, I believe, you'll see that here the authors did have the aim or objective. This was just us hiding it from you. So they do say that we've analyzed the data from a community traced cohort study to A, identify factors associated with disclosure longitudinally. Secondly, to assess the difference in self-reported adherence, viral suppression, and mental health. And finally, to explore the changes between the different study rounds. And I just really want to emphasize how important it is that both here in the introduction section of your paper, but also in that introduction to your abstract, that final section or sentence, in the case of the abstract, or the final paragraph of your introduction really needs to include this aim or objective so that it's very clear to your reader what the point was of your research or what you were set out to do. Next slide. So moving on now from the introduction, you can go to the next slide. We shift to the methods. Now, the methods, as an epidemiologist, is my favorite part because this is where you share your recipe. And this is just so important that you come into it with that sort of mindset. The idea is that you describe exactly what you did so that someone else could do exactly the same thing. So this is not where you keep secrets. This is where you are very transparent, you are very open, and you provide all of the details required for someone to see what you did. So you want to show the procedures, the interventions, what data you use, how you analyzed it, what statistics you used. You also want to include the research approval link. And you want to make sure that you write this in the past tense. This is something that I think is really important because this is what you have done. This has already happened, it's previous. You'll also see more and more with journals that within the methods section, they'll have online annexes. So if you did do a questionnaire or you did collect some sort of demographic data, or maybe you were doing qualitative work and you had a focus group discussion guide, that you could even include that. So the idea with the methods is really, again, can't restate it enough, to tell people what you did. Also really, really important, and a common error in a methods section is don't talk about your results here. This is not where you share what you found. This is just your methods, so just what you did do. Now, there was a question in the chat I've been trying to follow around where tables and figures fit into papers. And it is true that primarily tables and figures are going to be within the results section, but it is also, in some studies, it does make sense to include a table or often a figure in the methods section when you talk about maybe how people were recruited and where they fell out in terms of meeting your inclusion or exclusion criteria. So just review some of the literature that's been done to date, and you can see that sometimes in the methods, maybe a table is used to describe the intervention compared to the standard of care. So that would be when you're describing methods, you could have a table or figure, but generally, again, tables or figures are within the results where you report what you found. On to the next slide. So here, this is again a structure. So you can think about all of the W questions. So the who, where, what, and when, and also the how. And you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide, a little recipe box. And again, you want to share your recipe. And here you'll see also at the bottom, we've included this scale because you're always going to have this balance with word limits and writing. But this method section is really where I would say, spend more of your time, spend more of your word limit here in the methods, making sure you provide all of the necessary details. The other thing is, you can go to the next slide, that rather than having a really, really long methods section that's all paragraph after paragraph, consider using some subheadings. So here in the paper from the Eastern Cape with the adolescents, you can see that the authors chose to use subcategories. So in this instance, they talked about study setting and design, the sample size, the data collection, the outcomes, the analysis, all right? And these are common and quite useful ways of structuring your methods section. You'll also see, to my earlier point, they have a figure here in the methods, which is the participants from the from the different types of things. So before universal test and treat, during universal test and treat, and during same day ART initiation. So there can be a time and a place for you to have figures within a figures within a methods. Marlene's messaging me to say this is actually from another paper, so my apologies, another paper in the journal where they had this great example of the subheadings. Thank you, Marlène, for that. Next slide. Now comes the results. Probably the thing that you're most interested in and most exciting to write, but also something that needs to be set up by a quality methods section. So again, your results are your key findings. You're not going to be able to present everything you found, but you are going to be wanting to present the main things that you found. It's also incredibly important with the results that you're specific and it's based on the data from your research. So you're not going to say I found a lot or I found a little. You're going to say I found 20 or I found 5.2%. And also included with that, you're going to want to include your measures of confidence. So things like confidence intervals or maybe p-values. I'd go for confidence intervals, but measures to show how sure you are of your findings based on your sample size. Again, caution against language that shows your findings and more let the numbers show the work for themselves. And as a storyteller, which is really what you're doing when you write a paper, consider how best to use tables and figures to also demonstrate what you found. And so this is often the first thing that you'll do when writing a results section, is you'll come up with some tables and figures and discuss with your co-authors which of those best show the main messages from your research. And again, a little bit similar to the introduction, you want to start with your big findings and get into the more specifics and details as you go. Highlighted in red here, we've said, don't speculate on what this means, and also don't repeat what you did. So again, the results are just about what you found, not whether or not it was interesting, not whether or not you expected it, but just what you found. So very objective. Next slide. Again, this is a little bit to reiterate how we want you to organize this. So all manuscripts are really quite formulaic, and there's a way in which we're used to reading results sections. And one way to familiarize yourself with this is to just read, and read some more, because these are ways in which you will learn to write an academic manuscript. So usually we start with a table 1 or a summary of the people that were in the study and their characteristics. So their age, gender, different descriptive characteristics, potentially about where they live, who they are. In the example from the Eastern Cape, they then looked at the predictors of disclosure, so what was associated with whether or not the adolescent had disclosed their HIV status. Then they looked at the associations between status and viral outcomes. And then they looked at differential changes between mental health symptoms and ART adherence during the different rounds. So also within your results section, where it makes sense, definitely consider having subheadings. These can either be included at the end, or you can just use them to structure your writing as you go. Next slide. So we're going to look at this results section and see what could be improved. So here we go. So among adolescents living with HIV unaware of their status at baseline, some participants participated in round 2. Among those adolescents, half are aware of their status by round 2. And among the adolescents who remained unaware of their status by round 2, half participated in round 3, with 40 learning their status. Rates of disclosure were higher among the older aged adolescents, and in total, many adolescents living with HIV learned their status between study rounds. Factors associated with learning one's status were older age and residing in an urban area at the previous time point. So now over to you guys, where I want to take this poll on the next slide, and we can launch this poll. What do you think could be done to improve this results section? Is it A, the data could be more specific? B, the results could be discussed? Or C, there's no need, it's just perfect? What do you guys all think? We're going to launch the poll, and I'm hoping to hear from many of you. I'm really excited to have 875 of you still on the webinar today. Okay, so a quarter of you have voted. Now a third. I'm going to see if I can get at least half of you to vote. What did you think of this results section? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Excellent. So I will end the poll, and I will share the results with all of you. Hopefully you can see those this time. And again, almost 3/4 of you said the data could be more specific. And I couldn't agree more. The results section really needs to include the data. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that what we were able to do is that we actually copy edited their results section, and they did include much more data. So you can see here they included absolute numbers, so 300 to 82. They've also included percentages, and they've also included adjusted odds ratios and confidence intervals. And this is really, really important. The other thing I would caution against is, as mentioned, they didn't talk about whether this was what they expected or not, right? This is just exactly what they found. And that's really important because that's what you want in the results. And also just to say, the results happened in the past, right? You conducted this research previously, and here's what you found. So you'll see here that past tense was used in the results section. Next slide. Now, an important word on tables and figures. So all of us learn differently, and for many of us, having things in visual format is a useful way to emphasize our main findings. What you want to do with your tables and figures is make sure that they reflect your key messages and that they show this and graphically or in a tabular format represent it. Now, some important considerations is that you want to make sure that your insert can stand on its own, meaning that it doesn't need more text to make it make sense. So make sure your axes are labeled and your titles are clear, and that any acronyms are spelled out. But also make sure that it's not redundant. So you don't want it to be exactly the same as what you wrote in your results section, but rather you reference it for sure in your results section for more details. And also be careful about using too many colors, because people may be printing these, or there are people who don't have the ability to see different colors. So you want to make sure that it's very, very legible. Again, I would recommend starting with your tables and figures and discussing with your co-authors before writing your results section, because these are really what you're going to see as your headline issues and headline findings from your research. Next slide. All right, so now we're on to the discussion. And the discussion is really where you are going to talk about why what you did is interesting and relevant. Again, you're going to start with, what did you find? And then how does this compare to work that's come before? Were you surprised? Does it add to findings previously? Does it contradict things that have been found? Or is it, to the first of your knowledge, the first data that suggests that X is similar to Y, depending on what your research was? You also want to spend time discussing the generalizability. So how generalizable is it to your population that you studied, but also beyond the population that you studied? And you also want to spend some time talking about the strengths and limitations of your study. And these, it's okay to have limitations. Every study has limitations. By definition, you can't study everyone with a condition or everyone with an exposure. So acknowledge what those are and how you address them. The other thing that you want to do is discuss what the implications are for this research, what they are for future research, and what they are for policymakers. And this is really important, given that you're working in public health. This isn't research just for research's sake. This is research to hopefully improve prevention, treatment, care for people, in this case, living with or at risk of acquiring HIV. Also, don't overreach. So don't be so grandiose in your statements that you think this is the best research that has ever happened and this is just amazing and incredible. Be a little bit more humble than that, and make sure you don't overstep what your research actually can conclude or what you can actually say as a result of your research. Next slide. So here's the discussion. I'm not going to read this. You can obviously, and I hope you will download this paper after this session, but this is to give you an idea of how a results or a discussion section is structured. So they start with their main findings in the opening paragraph, and that's really key, the headlines in terms of what the results were. Then they talk with each of the main results, how this compares to what was known before their research. So how does this compare to what happened, and how does this add to what we knew before? And then following this is a strengths and limitations section, where they're honest about their limitations. So first, they only recruited some of who was eligible. Second, they chose to make awareness of status a binary or dichotomous variable, which has concerns. Third, it was all based on self-report. And finally, they only would have had viral suppression data on some of the people. So this is all fair, and it's always better to be more open and honest, especially in manuscript writing. I'll stick to that. Next slide. Now, your conclusions may be a separate section of your paper, or it may be the final paragraph of your discussion based on the author guidelines and the structure of the journal you choose to submit to. Be sure to state your take-home messages and emphasize the wider implications. So what, again, this means for clinical practice, for research, for policymakers, what you see as the next steps. And this is really your call to action and your call to arms to kind of invite people to join you in what you think needs to happen. And again, try and avoid being too obvious or overstating or being overgeneralizable. So don't make sweeping statements here in your conclusion. And on the next slide, here is locations were factors associated with disclosure in these adolescents. They acknowledged that there was no increase in mental health systems in the study that they found. but they were humble, right? They said that these findings suggest, okay? And I think that that's important because very rarely are we able to say with absolute certainty that something is causal. And so they're saying this is what their findings suggest. Next slide. So in summary, here's your one slide summary of what I've talked about. So your intro, you go with the background to context to challenge to the question. Your methods, you're going to hit on all your W words, so the who, what, where, when, and also the how. Your results are going to be in this logical way, and you're going to consider also potentially some subheadings there. You're also going to write it in the past tense. Again, yes, so intro, methods, and results are in the past tense because they already happened, and that's just a flag. And then in terms of your discussion, you're going to take your headline messages, break them down a bit in terms of how they compare to what you knew before. You're going to talk about the strengths and limitations, and then have your final concluding paragraph on implications going forward. And again, so for that, both the discussion and the conclusion are in present tense because this is what we think now, and this is where we're headed. And with that, I will hold over to Marlène. Just want you to remember that you're storytellers here, but you're factual storytellers. So this is not subjective, it's objective. So a good scientific article has more to do with more than just presenting the data. You got to tell a clear story. So we look forward to hearing your clear stories. Thanks, Marlène.
Thank you, Anna. So now you know everything about how to write a manuscript. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the second part, which is understanding the editorial process of an article publication. And the first part is really how to choose a journal and submit a manuscript. And there are many journals, so it can be a bit dreadful sometimes. So we would like to give you some tips on how to find the right journal for your research. And we could say that it is basically a three-part exercise. And the first part will be identifying your primary audience. The second part will be then identifying potential journals, and then narrowing that down and selecting maybe 2 or 3 journals to consider. So you need to ask yourself several things. The first thing, which is extremely important, is who is your target audience? So who do you need to reach? Which readers would find your research most useful? What fields or disciplines match your topic? Then you need to ask yourself, what type of journal should you publish in to reach this target audience that you have identified? So is it more that you're going to have to submit into a general interest or specialized journal? Do you want to submit in an international, a regional, or local journal? Do you need to submit in an open access journal, for example, because your grant requires you to? Or can you submit, or do you want to submit in a subscription-based journal? So look at the journals that you are actually reading whenever you're looking at information on your topic. And then the other step, which is quite important as well, is what is the reputation of a journal? So ask yourself, do a little bit of digging, do a little bit of homeworks, and ask yourself, who are the editors of a journal? Who are the editorial board members? Do you know them? Have you heard about them? Have you read papers from them? How serious is the peer review process? Is the journal indexed in legitimate abstract and indexing services? What is the journal impact factor, for example? Are there any publication fees? And if any, are they clearly indicated? You don't want to have a bad surprise after submitting. How many articles have been published by the journal? Is it 2, or is it a paper, like a title that exists, I don't know, have been existing and being around for 10 years? Do your colleagues have any experience submitting to the journal? So this is a lot of, it can be a bit tedious, but it's very useful to make sure that you don't spend an enormous amount of time writing your paper for a journal and just realizing that actually this is not a good fit for you. You also want to make sure that you avoid predatory journals that sometimes publish, have like very weak peer review process, for example, and will publish your research at any cost, but with a terrible peer review process. So you don't want to send your very precious research findings to a bad journal, if I can say so. When it's done, what we recommend that you do is really looking at the instructions. Again, nothing more frustrating than writing and formatting a paper for a specific journal or just starting writing and realizing that your journal of interest, your dream journal, might be GIS, is actually requiring 3,500 words. And actually you wrote 5,000. So now you're going to have to trim. So make sure you have in mind the instruction for authors. So go look at the journal webpage, examine a recent issue of a journal. This will also give you a good indication on whether the journal is publishing articles like your article with the same topic, whether you're still within the proper scope of a journal. And there are resources to help you write an article that you should really look at. There are many guidelines online, and we linked here the Equator Network because there are reporting guidelines for many types of studies. So feel free to have a look. From our editor's point of view, what we see as being most often ignored are the word count. So research article, 3,500 words, we're receiving 6,000. Obviously, this is not going to work out for us. Incorrect formatting, wrong subheadings, references is incorrect. Table of figures are not formatted as requested by the journal's guidelines. Poor quality or abbreviation that are not being right out the first time they are written in the manuscript. So those are very easy mistakes that we can see. Sometimes what we can see as well is, and we'll go maybe about that a bit more after, submitting a paper, it's sometimes a very complicated and difficult process. You're going to get rejected. It will happen all the time. It happened to me, it happened to Anna when we were doing some research. I'm not still doing, but this is part of the life of any researcher. You're writing a paper for a journal, you're getting your paper rejected from this journal. But we need you to reformat your article for the next journal. Otherwise, as an editor, when I will receive an article which is formatted for what I know is another journal, it gives me an indication that your paper got rejected from this journal. So it doesn't send a very good signal. So between submission, take a little bit of time to reformat according to the specific journal's guidelines. Now, what is happening? So I took an example from BMG. And how do you go from point A, which is submitting your manuscript, to point B, publishing your article? So this is the publishing process of BMG, but it's actually very common. It's the same for GIS. And there are many steps happening whenever you're submitting a manuscript. Usually the first step is that your paper will be checked and discussed by the editorial team. So upon submission, we will decide whether we think that it's not a good fit for our journal and reject it right away, or we will decide to send it to peer review. So we do not systematically and automatically send all paper we are receiving to peer review. Then once this is done, the reviewers will appraise the papers, and depending on the journals, we will make sure that we have from 2 to 3 good reviews from experts in your field appraising your paper. Then when we get the review, again, there's a moment of assessment for us, and we check the reviews and we decide whether we think the paper is good enough to go and whether we're going to ask the authors to revise, or we might decide at this step to reject the paper because the reviewers have flagged major issues in the methodology, for example, or because we think that the amount of revision requested are not realistic. So that can be a rejection step at that stage. If we invite the authors to revise, we will give them, depending on the journals, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months to revise. And again, we will reappraise the revised manuscript. Sometimes the paper goes back to reviewers if needed. Sometimes the editors are making the call, and there's the final decision on whether the paper again should be rejected or accepted. So as you can see, it's a very lengthy process with a lot of people being involved. But what are the most common reasons for rejection? What we see sometimes is papers submitted to the journal that do not fit within the scope of a journal. Papers where the objectives of the study are not clear, and Anna insisted on that. You need to make that very clear in your introduction of both the main text and the abstract. You need to understand what you are doing. Sometimes it's because the results are not so important, but it is like repetition of things that have been already published, or very detailed, like you try to publish a very, very detailed point of a bigger study. Some journal will find it interesting, others won't. An important thing to keep in mind is that being rejected or getting your paper, you're not being rejected as an individual, but your paper will be rejected, and it's normal, completely normal. Another criteria is looking at whether the study contributes something novel, whether the study design and the methodology are valid, and whether the presentation is of good quality. If you made it and your paper was sent out to peer reviewers and you're getting the peer review comment, take a breath and take a moment. Sometimes you're going to get some very long and detailed list of comments from your reviewers. That's good. This is actually to make your paper better. And there are a lot of chances that if things are unclear for your reviewers, they will be unclear for your readers as well. So respond to every question and comment. List them, number them, and respond, for example, in a different format or a different font. Your editors would be happy with that. Include reference to where in the text you have made the change. Use the comment constructively. And as I was saying, the reviewers are not doing that because they're just like annoying and mean. They just do that generally to make your paper the best version of the paper it can be. If you disagree with a reviewer, that's okay, completely okay, but you need to provide a clear reason why. So consider expressing your point differently if a reviewer did not understand what you were saying. And if it is a massive sort of misunderstanding or difference in opinion, argue, but argue with data, with published literature. Just don't say, oh no, he didn't understand. So consider bringing up the disagreement within the discussion if you feel that it will enrich and make it stronger. Keep your reply short and to the point. Thank the reviewers for their constructive comments. Remember that their reviewers are doing that on their free time. They're not being paid. So it's really to help the science, to help your paper being better, and to help you as authors. And as mentioned, always be polite, be respectful. Do not try to be sarcastic or rude. Likely, you won't really have a very positive outcome doing that. Few very brief points about publication quality and ethics. What we see as being the sort of 7 scenes, the 7 major scenes are carelessness, so citation bias, understatement, negligence, faulty analysis. Do not put only the citation that go like of papers that are agreeing with you. Like if the field is split, discuss the paper that are showing different results than your paper. Plagiarism, so those include undisclosed sources, copying of text without references. You can make reference to others. You can't just like copy paste and get credit for the work of others. Redundancy, which is the salami publication of self-plagiarism, which is trying to do as many paper as possible and spreading very, very thin. Or editors won't really like that if there's nothing really new, and if 2 papers would have made more sense as being one, just make one big paper. Undeclared competing interests, whether they are personal, professional, and financial. You may have different competing interests, or you may find that actually you don't have any COI. It's not up to you to decide. If you receive some, I don't know, money to make a talk at whatever conference, just say it, just be very transparent. The most terribles are 6 and 7, subject violation, whether it's human and animal. So for example, you conducted study, but you didn't have any approval from an ethical review board. I think it speaks to itself. It's highly unethical. And the 7th one is fraud. You know, those data that are just appearing overnight. Don't do that. Don't falsificate. Don't fabric data. The consequences can go from rejection or retraction to much bigger, like going to your institution or even legal case. We are coming towards the end of the meeting, so there are a few useful resources on the slides that I invite you to go to after the meeting, and we have 5-6 minutes for the resource for the questions. So we're going to answer with Anna. Anna, if you can come back on the virtual stage, and we will answer to some of the questions in the Q&A. And just before we start, you will have a survey at the end of the workshop that will just pop up. Super useful for us if you can fill it out. It helps us understand what your needs are and plan our workshops accordingly. So now let's go and look at the questions. Anna, would you like to start?
Sure. I've been typing frantically and I tried to put some up as answer live and now I'm trying to find them. So maybe just to say a few common threads that have come up would be that the figures and tables shouldn't be entirely a crossover of what's in the results section, right? So if you present every piece of data in a table in the text, then that's redundant and that's not necessary. So you want to have some of the numbers in, at least one, so that it's referenceable, but it shouldn't include all of it. The other piece I would say that has come up quite consistently is you guys are talking about subheadings. And I think what I tried to tell you is that a manuscript, at least for quantitative HIV research, is very, very formulaic. And so I would actually recommend putting in subheadings for all sections, and then that allows you to stick to the point and then remove the subheadings at the end, especially from the introduction and discussion, but keep them in potentially for methods and results, because those are going to be very helpful for your reader. So those would be two things that have come up a lot. The one I was going to ask Marlène about earlier is that you are the owner of your work, you and your institution and the people that participated. So someone had asked about whether or not they could withdraw their research at any time before publication. And my understanding is that absolutely, yes, you can. You can write and simply say that you've made another plan or you want to withdraw it. And maybe just finally, before I turn over to Marlène to answer a couple of things, I think that keep this openness message as one of the takeaways. So if you present your findings at a conference, some of you have talked about this, you can still publish them. Just tell the journal that you presented them at a conference. So what journals don't want to do is be publishing the same thing as previously published, but that's different than previously presented. So that would be something else that I would just wanted to comment on. Marlène?
Yes, I'm looking.
It's an overwhelming number of questions. Apologies.
There are lots. So we're really sorry if we're not able to answer to all the questions that are in the chat. I was seeing a question about, okay, let's take them by order. Do we need to include the why question in the methods? No, the why question is really about the introduction. This is where you're just saying, that's the big, like sort of you setting up the scene. This is the main problem. This is the issue. This is why we're gonna address this point. And in the method section, you're gonna focus more on the how you're gonna do that and give all the information about where the study took place and how you did your study and who were the study participant and so on. But the why, the rationale for your research should be in the introduction of both your abstract and both your main question.
Maybe just on qualitative paper. So neither Marlène or I in any part of our lives have been qualitative researchers, but the same format and the same principles apply. So in terms of sample size, you still need to have sufficient sample size to draw conclusions with qualitative research, right? So you still need to be getting the same, getting sufficient evidence of the key themes in order to know what your sample size is. So I wouldn't say there's not, this is too few and this is too many. There's not a line in the sand, but there are many resources available to understand sample size for qualitative research. And then also, just in terms of word limit, I would say it's somewhat similar. So most papers, you're still going to spend more of your word limit on your results, on your methods and your results than on your intro or your discussion. But this is always a balancing act. I mean, I think we've told you to say lots in all places here, but you're going to have to prioritize at some stage. And my recommendation would be to prioritize what you did and what you found versus long-winded introductions and versus a lot of, you might not reference every previous study and how it compares to its results within the discussion. There was a question on the discussion about how you choose what you compare your results to, and this is really going to be based on your literature review and your understanding and the key publications that led you to your research question. So I would say don't exclude things that are glaringly obvious, and talk about things that are similar to yours in terms of context, or things that are different, right? Use your co-authors. I'll turn over to Marlène for the final word. Yeah.
Thanks. As Anna was saying, just before we conclude, the first part, actually, we will focus today on writing the manuscript and so on. Obviously, the first part, whenever you decide, even before deciding on like doing some research and designing your study, is reading as much as you can on the topic, because it's almost like you need to start by doing your own literature review, like understanding what others have been doing, what is the issue, like what is the unanswered question you want to answer to. And you can't do that without having a good understanding of your field. And while doing that, you will be sort of organically able to understand and flag the papers that are relevant for your own research, for your own question research. So and then, yeah, as there was a question like what considerations should we made in the discussion, study setting, methodology, or what else? Also depends on the kind of papers and the kind of sort of conclusion or that you got from your main findings. You can go as broad or as local as needed, basically. It's always hard because there's not like one answer to all the question. It's very not subjective, but it really depends on your specific paper. We are now done. It has been a great pleasure to have at least at some point 870 people in the room. So thanks so much for joining us. We will do other workshops later in the year, and we will share the recording of today's workshop very soon. So thanks again so much for your time, and have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.
Bye everyone.